The morning officer Dale Prout arrived at my property in response to a complaint that I was conducting illegal pool demolition without permits. I was standing at the edge of what had been my in-ground pool 48 hours earlier, holding a cup of coffee and a manila folder that contained every permit, every inspection certificate, every contractor license, every utility disconnection confirmation, and every regulatory approval document that the state of Tennessee, the county of Rutherford, and the municipality of Murfreesboro required for the legal demolition of a residential in-ground pool, organized in chronological order with tabbed dividers. And when Officer Prout walked through my side gate and saw me standing there with that folder, he said, "Good morning," and I said, "Good morning," and I handed him the folder before he had finished introducing himself, because I had been expecting him for 2 days and I had prepared accordingly. My name is Vivienne Aldrich. I am 44 years old, a licensed environmental engineer with 17 years of experience in site remediation, regulatory compliance, and construction permitting, and I have lived in the Cedarwood Park HOA development in Murfreesboro, Tennessee for 4 years. My husband Theo is an architect. Our house is a 4-bedroom contemporary on a corner lot that we had purchased specifically because the previous owners had installed an in-ground pool that we believed at the time of purchase we would use regularly, and that we had come to understand over 4 years of ownership we would not. The reasons were practical and accumulated. Our 2 children, both under 10, had learned to swim but did not use the pool with the frequency that justified its maintenance costs. The pool required between $4,000 and $6,000 annually in chemical treatment, equipment maintenance, and seasonal preparation. It occupied a significant portion of the rear yard that Theo wanted for a studio addition he had been planning since his 2nd year in the house, and for which the pool's footprint was the primary obstacle. And my environmental engineering background had made me increasingly attentive to the pool's chemical use and water consumption in a way that I found professionally difficult to ignore. We had decided to remove the pool in January and had begun the permitting process in February. I want to describe the permitting process in detail because the permitting process is the entire story. Pool demolition in Tennessee requires a demolition permit from the Municipal Building Department. It also requires confirmation of utility disconnection for any electrical service to the pool equipment, which in our case included the pump motor, the underwater lighting circuit, and the automated cover motor, all of which needed formal disconnection by a licensed electrician with a permit for each disconnection. It required a fill permit specifying the fill material and compaction method, because a filled pool that settles improperly creates a sinkhole hazard, and the county required a geotechnical review of the fill plan. It required a stormwater permit because filling a pool changes the site's drainage characteristics, and the municipality required a drainage impact assessment. And because our pool had a gas-fired heater that I had decommissioned 3 years earlier, but that remained physically connected to the gas line, it required a gas line disconnection permit and a pressure test certificate from the gas company. 6 permits. I had applied for all 6 in February. I had received all 6 by mid-March. I had scheduled the demolition contractor, a company called Rutherford Site Services, whose principal, Mark Danby, held an active Tennessee general contractor's license and a specific demolition endorsement, for the 3rd week of April. I had confirmed utility disconnections with Tennessee Gas and with the electrical contractor, a licensed master electrician named Carl Simmons, for the week before demolition. I had the geotechnical review completed and the fill plan approved. I had the drainage impact assessment reviewed and approved by the Municipal Stormwater Management Office. I had also notified the HOA, not because the CC and RS required notification for pool removal, which they did not specify, but because I am an environmental engineer and I notify relevant parties before conducting permitted work on my property as a professional practice that transfers naturally to my personal life. I had sent a written notification to Rachel Bloom at the HOA management company in March, providing the permit numbers, the contractor's license number, the work schedule, and a brief description of the process. Rachel had acknowledged the notification. Our neighbor to the east was a woman named Caroline Pfeiffer. Caroline was 63, recently retired from a career in real estate investment, and she had the specific quality of someone who had spent decades in a transactional business and brought transactional analysis to neighborhood situations, meaning she assessed everything in terms of value impact and found the pool demolition threatening to her assessment of our property's contribution to the neighborhood's character and by extension to her own property's value. She had come to our door in March when she noticed the permit applications had been filed, which she had apparently discovered by searching the county's public permit portal. She had expressed her concern about the value impact of removing a pool. Theo had explained our reasoning. She had said she thought we were making a mistake. I had said we appreciated her perspective and had made our decision. She had left without having altered our decision and without apparently having accepted that the decision was ours to make. Filed a complaint with the HOA in late March asserting that pool removal was an exterior modification requiring HOA approval under the CC&RS exterior modification provisions. Rachel Bloom had reviewed the relevant CC&R section and determined that exterior modifications covered additions and alterations to the home's structure and visible exterior features, and that pool removal did not fall within the provision's scope. The complaint had been dismissed. Caroline had appealed the dismissal to the full board. The board had reviewed the CC&R language and upheld the dismissal 4-1. The one dissenting vote had been a board member named Gerald Holt, who lived 2 houses from Caroline and who I had observed speaking with her on her front porch on 2 occasions in the preceding month. After the board upheld the dismissal, Caroline had apparently concluded that administrative channels were exhausted and had moved to what I can only describe as an investigative approach. She had appeared at my fence line twice while the utility disconnection work was ongoing, photographing the electrician's work and the gas company's work. I had noted the dates in my documentation log. The demolition contractor Mark Danby arrived at 7 on a Monday morning with an excavator and 2 crew members. By noon, the pool shell had been broken up and the rubble was being staged for removal. By Tuesday afternoon, the fill operation had begun with the geotechnically approved fill material compacted in 12-inch lifts per the approved fill plan. Caroline had called the municipal building department Monday afternoon. The building department had reviewed our permit status, confirmed all 6 permits were active and current, and told Caroline there was nothing to investigate. She had called the county environmental office Monday evening, asserting that the pool demolition was creating contaminated soil disposal issues. The county environmental office had called me. I had confirmed that all pool water had been dechlorinated and tested before drainage per the stormwater permit conditions, and the office had closed the inquiry. She had called the police Tuesday morning. Officer Prout had the folder in his hands for 4 minutes. He read the demolition permit. He read the fill permit. He looked at the contractor's license copy. He looked at the utility disconnection certificates. He looked at the drainage impact assessment approval. He looked at the gas line pressure test certificate. He closed the folder and handed it back to me. He said, "Everything is in order." I said, "Yes." He said, "You have 6 separate permits." I said, "The regulatory requirements for pool demolition in this municipality require 6 separate permits covering different aspects of the work. I applied for all 6 in February and received all 6 by March." He said, "The complaint alleged unpermitted demolition." I said, "I have been aware since Monday that the complaint was coming. I prepared this folder specifically for this conversation." He said, "You were expecting me." I said, "Someone has been photographing the work from my fence line for 2 days and has filed complaints with 2 other agencies. Yes, I was expecting a police visit." He said, "The other agencies?" I said, "Building department Monday afternoon, County Environmental Office Monday evening, both closed without finding. I have the confirmation numbers in the folder if you need them." He looked at the folder. He said, "I do not need them." He looked at the work site, which was a filled and compacted area where a pool had been 48 hours earlier. He said, "Is the work done?" I said fill operation complete as of this morning. Final compaction test is scheduled for this afternoon. Final grading will be completed tomorrow. Site restoration, including topsoil and seeding, will happen next week. He said everything is permitted and compliant. I said every element of this project has been permitted, inspected where required, and executed by licensed contractors. I have documentation for all of it. He said, I am going to note in my report that I attended this address in response to a complaint, reviewed the permit documentation, and found full compliance. I said, thank you. Please also note the permit numbers if your report format allows for that, because I believe this is the fourth separate complaint filed about this project, and I want a clean regulatory record showing the project's compliance status at each inquiry. He wrote the permit numbers in his notebook. He said, you have been keeping track of the complaint sequence. I said, I am an environmental engineer. Regulatory compliance documentation is my professional practice. He said, the person who filed this complaint. I said, I have not confirmed who filed it. I have my own observations about who has been photographing the work site from my fence line. He said, I cannot take action based on observations about who filed a complaint. I said, I understand. I'm not asking you to. He said, but if you have documentation of someone photographing your work site from your property boundary on multiple occasions, that documentation might be relevant to other proceedings. I said, I have time-stamped camera footage of 2 fence line photography events. Yes. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a law enforcement officer who has assessed a situation and found it clearly resolved. He said, have a good morning, Ms. Aldrich. I said, thank you, Officer Pruitt. He walked back through the side gate. I watched him go. Caroline was standing on the sidewalk across the street. She had been there since Officer Pruitt arrived. She watched him get in his patrol car. She watched his patrol car drive away. Then she looked at my property. I raised my coffee cup. She did not respond. She went inside. I called Andrea Mills from the backyard. She said, 4 complaints. I said building department, county environmental, and police, plus the original HOA complaint that was dismissed twice. She said, you have documentation of all 4. I said time-stamped records of each agency contact, the permit numbers they confirmed, and the outcome of each inquiry, plus the camera footage of the fence line photography on Monday and Tuesday. She said, the fence line photography. I said she came to my property boundary twice to photograph the licensed contractor's permitted work. I have footage. She said, I want to send a formal notice today. The pattern of complaints, each closing without finding, combined with the surveillance of your permitted work, creates a documentary record of harassment of a property owner engaged in fully permitted construction activity. I said, send it. Andrea's notice went to Caroline Pfeiffer that afternoon by email and certified mail. It was 6 pages. It documented the 4 complaint filings and their outcomes. It documented the fence line photography events with footage timestamps. It cited the HOA complaint and its 2-level dismissal. It noted that the pattern of filing complaints with multiple agencies about activity that all agencies had confirmed as compliant, combined with physical surveillance of the work site, was consistent with a campaign of harassment designed to interfere with my permitted property improvement. It demanded that Caroline cease all interference with my permitted construction activity and warned that continuation would result in civil proceedings. Caroline had retained an attorney by Thursday. Her attorney, a local property litigator named Howard Gaines, called Andrea the same day. Howard had reviewed the notice and the documentation, and his opening statement was that his client had acted out of genuine concern for neighborhood property values. Andrea said, your client filed 4 complaints with 4 different agencies about permitted construction activity. All 4 complaints were closed without finding after review of the same permits that have been on file since March. The property owner's permitted activity is not subject to interference by a neighbor's valuation concerns. Howard said, the fence line photography. Andrea said, my client has camera footage of 2 separate fence line photography events during active permitted construction. Photography of a neighbor's permitted construction activity from a property boundary is not itself a legal violation, but it is part of the documented pattern of conduct. Howard said, my client is concerned about the precedent of pool removal for neighborhood values. Andrea said, property owners in Tennessee have the right to remove permitted structures on their own property subject to obtaining the required permits, which my client did in full. A neighbor's concern about value impact does not create a legal right to interfere with permitted construction. Howard said, my client would like to resolve this without litigation. Andrea said, the notice demands cessation of interference with the permitted activity, which is now substantially complete. It also requests an acknowledgement that the complaint filings were not supported by factual violations, given that all 4 agencies confirmed full compliance. Howard said, my client maintains she acted in good faith. Andrea said, good faith does not describe a pattern of filing 4 complaints with 4 different agencies about an activity that is documented as compliant at the time of each filing. The permits were on public record from March. Howard called back the following day with Caroline's settlement position. She would pay Andrea's fees for the notice and the associated work, acknowledge in writing that the demolition had been fully permitted and compliant, and commit to not filing further complaints related to the completed work. Andrea consulted with me. I said, the acknowledgement is the essential element. I need Caroline's written acknowledgement on record that the project was fully compliant. The written acknowledgement arrived the following week. It said, in Caroline Pfeiffer's signature, that the pool demolition and fill work completed at the Aldrich property had been fully permitted by all relevant municipal and county authorities and had been executed in compliance with all applicable regulations, and that she acknowledged this fact. I filed it in the project documentation folder alongside the 6 permits, the contractor licenses, the utility disconnection certificates, the geotechnical review, the drainage impact assessment, and the records of 4 agency inquiries, all closed without finding. The folder was 3 inches thick. Theo came to my home office the evening after the acknowledgement arrived and found me filing the last document. He looked at the folder. He said, the complete record. I said, every element of the project, every regulatory interaction, and every interference attempt with its resolution. He said, you built this folder in parallel with building the demolition project. I said, documentation is built in parallel with the work it documents. That is standard regulatory practice. He said, you knew this was coming. I said, I knew someone was photographing licensed contractor work from my fence line and had already filed 4 complaints. The next step was predictable. He said, you were ready. I said, I am always ready when I have done the permitting correctly. The permits are the answer to every question that gets asked about compliant work. All you have to do is have them organized and available. He said, 6 permits and a 3-inch folder. I said, 6 permits and a 3-inch folder and an environmental engineer who has been doing regulatory compliance documentation for 17 years. He said, the pool is gone. I said, fill is compacted, grading is complete, topsoil is down, seeding next week. He said, and the studio. I said, the site is clear, you can start your permit application. He said, you already looked up the permit requirements. I said, residential studio addition in this municipality requires a building permit, a zoning variance application for accessory structure footprint, and an electrical permit for the studio circuit. I have the application forms. He looked at me with the expression of 22 years. He said, of course you have the application forms. I said, I pulled them last week. He said, while the pool was being demolished. I said the demolition was in the contractor's hands. I was not needed on site. It was a productive time to research the studio permit requirements. He said, Rosalind. I said, wrong story, I am Vivienne. He said, you know what I mean. I said, yes, I know what you mean. He went to make dinner. I closed the folder, labeled it, and filed it in the cabinet where I kept completed project records. The project was complete. The documentation was complete. The regulatory record was clean. The acknowledgement was on file. The backyard was a prepared site where a pool had been and where a studio would be. Everything was in order. Everything was always in order when you did the permitting correctly and kept the documentation current and organized the folder before the officer arrived. That was the professional standard. It applied to every project. It always would. Thumbnail text: she filed 4 complaints with 4 agencies about permitted demolition. The engineer had a 6 permit folder ready before the police car arrived.